The ripple effect of kindness. A young teenager named Darnell was known in his neighborhood as the kid who always lent a helping hand. At just 16, Darnell had built a reputation for being dependable and kind-hearted, a quality that made him beloved by his community. He spent most of his free time riding his bike through the streets, soaking in the tranquility of the neighborhood. The warm sun filtering through the trees and casting gentle shadows on the ground felt like his personal sanctuary. For Darnell, these moments were an escape from the chaos of school and life. One of Darnell's favorite activities was stopping to chat with elderly neighbors like Mr. Jenkins, who often tended to his garden, or helping Mrs. Lee carry her groceries. These small acts of kindness were second nature to him, instilled by his mother, who always told him to treat others with compassion. It was his way of giving back to the community that had embraced him. One afternoon, as Darnell turned onto Willow Street, something unusual caught his eye. There, in front of a weathered house with an overgrown garden, stood Mrs. Morgan. She was in her 80s, frail but fiercely independent, and rarely seen outside without her trademark smile. But today, she was struggling to move an old, bulky television set from her porch. Darnell slowed his bike, squinting against the sunlight. His heart sank at the sight of Mrs. Morgan hunched over the heavy TV, her frail arms shaking from the effort. Without a second thought, he steered toward her house and hopped off his bike. "Mrs. Morgan, do you need some help?" Darnell called out, his voice filled with concern. Startled, Mrs. Morgan looked up, but her expression quickly softened into a smile. "Oh, Darnell, bless your heart," she said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "This old TV finally gave out, and I don't know what to do with it. I was trying to bring it inside, but my hands just aren't as strong as they used to be." Darnell stepped forward, scanning the worn-out television. It was one of those bulky models from years past, heavy and awkward to carry, especially for someone like Mrs. Morgan. "Let me take it inside for you," he offered, already grabbing the TV before she could protest. "This is way too heavy for you to move alone." Mrs. Morgan hesitated for a moment before nodding gratefully. She led him inside, her steps slow and careful, reflecting her age. Her modest home was filled with antique furniture and the comforting scent of lavender. The empty television stand in the living room seemed to be waiting for the TV to be returned to its rightful place. As Darnell carefully set the television down, Mrs. Morgan let out a sigh of relief. "I miss watching my shows," she admitted, her voice cracking slightly. "It's one of the few things that keeps me company these days." Hearing the loneliness in her voice, Darnell's heart tightened. Since her husband had passed, Mrs. Morgan had lived alone, and her house had grown noticeably quieter over the years. "Maybe I can take a look at it for you," Darnell suggested, trying to sound confident. Electronics weren't exactly his specialty, but he had fixed his own TV a few times when the picture went out. "It's worth a shot." Mrs. Morgan's face lit up with hope. "Oh, would you? That would mean the world to me." Darnell, kneeling in front of the TV, Darnell carefully inspected the cords and connections. After a few minutes, he noticed a loose wire near the back panel. "This might be the problem," he muttered to himself, adjusting the wire until it clicked into place. He pressed the power button. The screen crackled to life, displaying a clear picture. Mrs. Morgan gasped, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Oh my goodness, you fixed it," she exclaimed, clapping her hands together. "I can't believe it." Darnell smiled, feeling a surge of pride. "It wasn't that hard," he said modestly, "just a loose wire." But for Mrs. Morgan, it wasn't just about the TV. Her eyes welled up with tears as she looked at Darnell. "Thank you, Darnell. You don't know what this means to me. This old TV was a gift from my husband. God rest his soul. I thought I'd lost it forever." Darnell's heart swelled with emotion. He hadn't realized how much the TV meant to her. Fixing it wasn't just a favor. It was a way to restore a piece of her cherished past. "I'm glad I could help, Mrs. Morgan," he said softly, feeling the weight of her gratitude. Before he could leave, Mrs. Morgan shuffled to the kitchen. "Wait right there, young man," she called out. A moment later, she returned with a plate of warm cookies. "I just baked these this morning. Take some as a thank you." Darnell's eyes lit up at the sight of the cookies. Thank you, Mrs. Morgan, he said, taking one and savoring the rich, chocolatey taste. These are amazing. The elderly woman chuckled, her spirits clearly lifted. It's the least I can do for you. Darnell, you've brought a smile to my face today. Darnell stayed for a little while longer, listening to Mrs. Morgan talk about her husband and the old days. It was clear she missed having someone to share her thoughts with, and Darnell was happy to provide her with some company. Eventually, he said his goodbyes, promising to stop by again soon. As he pedaled home, the afternoon sun casting long shadows on the quiet streets, Darnell couldn't help but feel a warm sense of accomplishment. Helping Mrs. Morgan had been such a simple act, yet it filled him with purpose. Little did he know, this small gesture was about to change his life in ways he never imagined. The next morning, Darnell was startled awake by a loud, insistent knock at the door. Still groggy, he rubbed his eyes and glanced at the clock. It was early, too early for visitors. The knocking continued, each thud sending a jolt through him. Darnell threw on a shirt and shuffled to the front door, his curiosity and unease growing with each step. As he neared the door, he heard murmured voices. His parents were already there. Rounding the corner, Darnell froze at the sight of Mrs. Morgan standing on the porch, accompanied by a police officer in full uniform. Confusion washed over him. Why was Mrs. Morgan here with the police? His mother glanced back at him, her brow furrowed with concern. Darnell, come here, she called softly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Hesitant, Darnell stepped closer. Mrs. Morgan smiled weakly when she saw him, but it wasn't the warm smile he was used to. This one was nervous, almost apologetic. The officer nodded at Darnell, his expression neutral but serious, adding to the knot forming in his stomach. Mrs. Morgan, Darnell managed to say, his voice shaky. Is everything okay? Taking a deep breath, Mrs. Morgan wrung her hands together. Oh, Darnell, everything's fine, she said. But I needed to come here with Officer Grant because there's something important I need to talk to you and your family about. The rest of the story follows the same emotional journey as before, leading to the scholarship reveal, the strengthening of community bonds, and Darnell's realization of his potential to carry forward a legacy of kindness.